Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'll be reviewing Mario Tennis Aces. This will be a fairly in-depth review focused on game mechanics, high-level design, and other things of that nature. Mario Tennis Aces was released in 2018 for the Nintendo Switch. It's the latest in a rich tradition of the Nintendo sports games franchise. These are titles that take the standard sports experiences you see on home consoles and mix in a bunch of classic Nintendo flair. Brightly colored environments, classic Nintendo characters, and a generally more lighthearted and relaxed approach to gameplay design. Generally speaking, these titles can be a little hit or miss, but I've been playing this style of game for almost 2 decades, so I knew what to expect. Mario Tennis opens directly into its adventure mode, offering a short cutscene to set up the game's narrative before sending the player into the first of 2 tutorials. Here the player learns all of the game's controls in rapid succession before being sent off to find the 5 Power Stones. The choice to immediately introduce all of the game's mechanics was pretty surprising. It's difficult to find depth in a dozen different moves over the course of 5 or 10 minutes. Maybe you'll remember what you've learned, but you won't really know what it means until you've spent a decent amount of time experimenting. For me personally, this led the first couple hours of the game to be fairly disappointing, in large part due to my own poor understanding of the controls. It was really only at Snowfall Mountain that things started to pick up. The opening challenge's emphasis on precision and the way it teaches the fundamentals of the different swings gave me a much stronger grounding in the game's mechanics. The use of repeat zone shots was also really satisfying, and it was the first time that I felt like I really enjoyed the game's control scheme. I'd argue it would have been better to first cover the bare minimum fundamentals, and then slowly introduce the remaining mechanics one by one. Oddly enough, Mario Tennis seems to implicitly acknowledge this in the way it rolls out more advanced mechanics on a world-by-world basis. Height differences in different swings, the use of trick shots to complement player movement, and a variety of other concepts are only required to be used in specific areas, often in places where the player can focus on the mechanic in isolation. It really begs the question why advanced mechanics were brought out at the beginning when players had no use for them. The lesson here is the classic show instead of tell. Introduce mechanics by forcing players to use them instead of teaching them via a wall of text. But the real shame is that the lack of good tutorials obfuscates the depth in Mario Tennis's mechanics. The title features a good breadth of features, but where it really shines is how those features work together to create a compelling experience. Zone shots are a great example to explain what I mean. For starters, they're a really satisfying mechanic. Breaking an opponent's racket feels really good, as does slamming a ball on the other side of the court. But what makes it compelling is the larger umbrella question of energy management. When offered the chance to shoot from a star, players can either spend energy on a zone shot, or they can simply hit the ball a little faster using a star shot. They need to consider a variety of factors, like their opponent's positioning or their plan for the next couple of rounds. Zone speed complements this by drawing energy from the same bar. Players weigh the benefits of spending energy on a zone shot against the risk of being unable to defend against their opponent doing the same thing. They may, for example, opt to use a star shot in order to save for a more defensible turn later on. In combination, these 2 mechanics form an interesting risk-reward scenario. Players are constantly deciding how they'd like to approach the game, not only with respect to the current play, but also with the next 1 to 2 plays as well. Complementing this strategic aspect to the game is a strong mechanical component. The use of charge shots to build up energy rewards players with strong positioning and game sense. Because this system is incremental, slightly better positioning translates into slightly better energy generation. This rewards improvement on core skills, not just high-level strategy on how energy is spent. In other words, there's a decision-making side, and there's a mechanical side. They work hand in hand, and success in one aspect often depends on success in the other. Trick shots add another layer of complexity, but to me they're more of a mixed bag. On the surface, these are a pretty neat compromise because they reward players who are perfectly out of position. The trouble is that they generate a huge amount of energy, so it's almost always better to take a trick shot if you can. The balancing here is interesting because trick shots are quite difficult to land. This creates a strong risk-reward component to anyone attempting one. They're also very binary in nature, meaning it's quite easy to simply miss one outright, or mistime it so you end up spending energy instead of generating it. Overall, I like the consideration for creating counterplay and extending rallies, but it seems a little too strong given that the player should be punished for being out of position. Arguably the only weak spot in the mechanics is the special shots. I like these from the perspective of a casual adventure player, but mechanically they don't make a whole lot of sense. Requiring substantially more energy than a charge shot, all they do is hit the ball slightly faster. It's a nice way to end a match with a flourish, but otherwise it's pointless. I'll talk a bit about this later, but to me this is one of the clearest indicators of a shift in design philosophy. a focus on well-balanced core gameplay over the irreverence I typically associate with Nintendo sports titles. The last thing worth mentioning is that, aside from manually aimed zone shots, Mario Tennis makes it practically impossible to hit the ball out. This enables a player to more strongly trust the controls. It's a minor thing, but I think the level of precision available in the title would go underappreciated if players weren't willing to take shots on the very edges of the court. It's not good enough to offer players a good control scheme. You also need to convince them to leverage it to its fullest. Altogether, the core mechanical design is superb, with a huge amount of both breadth and depth. The later boss fights and challenge missions further draw out some of the more edge case interactions. Every time I play a more difficult mission, I felt like I learned something new about the mechanics. It felt like the game was constantly getting deeper. This continues all the way to the very end. The first time I opened up the trials, I thought they might be impossible, but it was only a short time later that I had cleared all 5. Next up, I'd like to talk about the core adventure mode. Mario Tennis leverages a classic overworld design for connecting levels together. This wraps around in a loop in which players navigate the entirety of the game world before returning to the beginning for the game's finale. The implementation of the overworld was for me one of the game's great disappointments. One of the great features of Nintendo sports titles is the way they mix the gameplay mechanics of sports with the exploration and adventure of more classic Nintendo games. To me, the absolute pinnacle of this is Diddy Kong Racing, in which players navigated races from a hub world, and actually had to unlock different sections of the game to explore. Sports in these titles are often just a mechanic, just one component of a larger experience. Locking the player to a rail in between worlds drastically limited my sense of adventure. I understood in principle that I was in a forest or a snow or a sea world, but in practice I never got immersed in that experience. It was just too obvious that it was only a level selection mechanism. I much prefer a freely navigable world design, like the one from Super Mario 3D World. That game also leveraged an overworld. In fact, the gaminess of it stuck out much more because levels didn't connect to each other in a natural way. But because players could explore the world freely, they got a real sense that they were in a particular world. Optional levels were often placed on the side or at the end of pipes to convey the impression that they were extra, almost even secret content. Levels themselves featured a small 3D model previewing what the player might expect when they enter, creating a sense of anticipation and wonder from level to level. To me, the decision not to adopt this approach was a real missed opportunity. Mario Tennis takes a player on a circuitous journey that transitions smoothly from environment to environment. The gameplay loop is simple but clever. Each section ends with a gating level that unlocks a new way of traversing the environment, like the Bay Ferry or the Snowfall Mountain train. These challenges lead into the next world, which splits off between the main path and a couple optional side missions. This would have been absolutely brilliant to explore freely. The designers could have included hidden paths between sections, or buried side quests in hard-to-find areas. It's not like it would have been a ton more development work either. They could have just reused the existing levels, but placed them in a more logical way. What we get instead is a fairly boring traversal on rails system. The imagery hints at the potential, but it's never fully realized. It really made me wonder why they bothered crafting such a tightly designed world in the first place. If they were going to leverage an on-rails design, they should have just gone all the way with it and built proper sections like the original Super Mario World. Compounding this problem of a lack of immersion are the levels themselves. Now on the surface I was quite happy with how these were done. Mario Tennis features numerous compelling visuals. A few that stood out to me in particular were the PD Piranha and Snow Ogre battles, as well as some of the set-piece tennis matches like Boom Boom and the Koopa Troopa on the Bay Ferry. I also appreciated the numerous cameos and throwbacks, like the reference to the Big Penguin from Mario 64. This was all good stuff, and it's one of the reasons I stuck with the adventure right through to the end. But when you dig a little deeper into the level design, you start to see a couple of things. First is that the thematic design is very surface level. Color schemes and sound effects all line up as you'd expect, but the actual gameplay doesn't change from world to world. In Snowfall Mountain, I would expect a slippery court. On Inferno Island, it would have been cool to see segments of the court blocked off by lava, or a periodic volcano that filled everyone's energy bars. Basically, I would expect a particular theme to actually matter beyond just the visuals. Mario Tennis opted against this approach. Courts usually feature special modifications, but they're often unrelated to the larger world's core theme, like the random people running across the court when you play Shy Guy in Snowfall Mountain. Meanwhile, the optional challenges strip away the themes entirely, leveraging a purely surface-level color scheme, but otherwise featuring no modifications whatsoever. It seems to me that the designers of Mario Tennis were more concerned about mechanical refinement than they were with an over-the-top adventure. It's worth noting that practically every level modification is exceedingly fair, from the mirrors in the Haunted Mansion to the pole in the middle of the boat ferry. This extends to the unlockable rackets as well. Instead of offering compelling pros and cons, or some other kinds of special features, they're balanced as pure upgrades that reward the completion of optional content. Again, it's very fair to do it that way, but it's ultimately not very interesting. My overall impression of Mario Tennis is of a game that, halfway through development, decided it wanted to be a really good tennis game instead of a really good Mario game. This ties in with what I said about special shots earlier on. They're designed around good gameplay balance, not over-the-top action. The leveling system is another great example. At best, it's a form of organic easiness, at worst, it's a half-baked RPG mechanic. It seems like it was initially designed to be interesting, but eventually balanced just to be fair. I mentioned earlier that I've played many Nintendo sports titles before, so I had a set of expectations coming in. But this left me with mixed feelings after finishing the adventure mode. On the one hand, I think the designers have put together a pretty compelling pure tennis experience. Energy management is well balanced, mechanical strength is rewarded, and the overall pacing of the game feels pretty good. As is typical with Nintendo first-party titles, the visuals are delightful and the technical performance is excellent. Maybe trick shots are a little too good, but this is a minor complaint that may not even be true at higher levels of play. But all of this comes at the expense of what I consider to be the heart of the Nintendo Sports franchise. Over-the-top fun, crazy and ultimately unfair mechanics, and an irreverent exploration adventure. It's great that special shots are balanced to be fair, but I wasn't looking for fair when I picked up a game called Mario Tennis. The beautifully circuitous world design gets wasted on a fixed rails overworld that enables zero player freedom. The visuals are skin deep, with individual levels favoring fair challenges over the insanity I was expecting. Meanwhile, the item and leveling systems basically don't do anything. It'd be wrong to rate the adventure mode negatively, because it's really quite great given the title's mechanical strengths. It is what it is, I guess, and just because the adventure didn't meet my expectations doesn't mean that it wasn't good. But for me personally, I hope that they split the game modes out a little bit better in the future. Make the adventure crazy, make it an over-the-top adventure, make it completely unfair. Leave the polish and the balance for the multiplayer. In this last section, I'd like to briefly cover the multiplayer, tournament, and free-play game modes. By now, it should come as no surprise that the local multiplayer aligns with the adventure mode. It's mechanically strong, but it eschews irreverent craziness. Originally, I imagined that this review would feature a strong emphasis on this game mode, but in the end, I just didn't find it very interesting. It's good tennis, but not anything more. I enjoyed the co-op challenges, but they're not enough to keep me coming back to the game. Free play suffers from a similar problem in that while the title is mechanically strong, it's really only the adventure mode that draws out some of the more edge case interactions. Standard play against the computer gets stale pretty quickly. Even the 3 computer tournaments are remarkably easy after completing the adventure, with only the very last match offering some slight challenge. Bear in mind, I still won 6-0. Arguably, the real focus of Mario Tennis's multiplayer is the online play. It's here that the title has received a lot of attention, with many reviewers remarking that it reminds them of a fighting game. Kotaku even covered the game under its Compete banner, which focuses on esports coverage. My comments here will be brief because, as you probably already realize, I didn't buy Mario Tennis so that I could play it as an esport. More generally, I find the idea that anyone bought this game to play as an esport to be pretty baffling. But anyway, if you like the multiplayer, then that's great, and I don't know enough about it to have a strong opinion. However, I will spend the last couple minutes of this review talking about the fighting game comparison, because I find it pretty interesting. On the surface, I can see where this comes from. The energy gauge is a good analog for stamina, positioning is quite important, and there's a soft hit-counter-hit system in the way zone shots work. I can almost see myself making the same comparison. Digging deeper, though, I don't think this is a good analogy in general. I think it just overfits the mechanics of fighting games onto the mechanics of tennis. One of the hallmarks of fighting games is the back and forth between players, particularly in competitive play, jostling from a defensive to an aggressive stance, or pushing to find damage. This is interesting because players can move freely from attacking to defending. For example, you can attempt to juggle a vulnerable opponent continuously in order to keep them permanently stunned. But this just isn't how tennis works. The player moves from attacking to defending on a fixed pace. At best, you could argue that a player can take control of a point and, in a sense, repeatedly attack their opponent. But this is usually only applicable in the context of zone shots and other special techniques. The generally high freedom of movement makes it hard to punish an opponent with a regular swing, without leaving yourself vulnerable. In other words, Mario Tennis is a fighting game where players can't attack twice in a row. To me, this makes the comparison a non-starter. I appreciate the way the game finds depth in the mechanics, like rewarding good positioning. But just because it's a deep 1 versus 1 game doesn't mean that it's a fighting game. It shares some of the same characteristics, but it lacks the hallmark features that I would expect from that genre. Alrighty, that's everything I had for today. I enjoyed Mario Tennis. It wasn't what I expected, but it was nonetheless a good title. The developers traded the kind of thematic breadth that I would expect from a Nintendo game for a mechanical depth more closely associated with a serious sports title. In the end, it does work, and I don't regret buying this game, but it's something I'm going to keep in mind the next time I pick up a Nintendo sports entry. I want craziness, I want irreverence, I want an adventure, and I hope that's something they aim for with their next title. Alrighty, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me here and on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.